I'll share with you my experience plastering this attic conversion, a tricky proposition due to all the funny angles involved. I'll give you the perspective from a novice, the tips I learned along the way, which should help you in deciding whether to go for it yourself. If it's just skim on new plasterboard, and which I'm focusing on here, you can do it, and I'll show you how. So with that said, let's jump into it. Once the plasterboard is all fixed, per my previous videos, where I'm sure there's a link above, we can move on. First we need some scrim tape, and that goes over all the gaps and joints in your plasterboard. You can buy scrim tape here, and a couple of rolls did me for this area of plasterboard. You can get orange tape, which I've heard can be a bit easier to apply. Just remember to have a knife handy with a new blade to cut cleanly. I've seen experienced plasterers use the edge of their trowel, but I tried this method and failed terribly, with strands of scrim getting all over me, and it became a total nightmare. With the scrim applied, it's time for your beads. I just used two types for this project, a corner bead and a stop bead. The corner bead gets you this clean, crisp edge at your external corners, and the stop bead is for where you're stopping just one side only, say around windows where no corner exists, for example a sill, or these wide angles around the roof windows. And I'll use these tin snips for cutting. Just cut the corner beads at an angle so the edges don't scrape against each other or the other walls, and these snips were super cheap and did the job just fine. And while you can fix these beads with a hammer and some large head short galvanized nails, a good hack I like is just using a staple gun. I use this lovely DeWalt one, which I bought here I think, and just make sure the staples you're using are rust proof, so for example stainless steel, and stick them in at around about 200mm centers. These are just temporary fixings because once the plaster dries it will hold it all in rigid. And just as a side note, when I worked with a master builder, when I was learning this stuff, he always tried to get joiners to apply the beads in areas that required high accuracy, as joiners will be used to getting things like beads plumb and square on a daily basis. So have that pride as you fix your own beads, and especially for things like access panels like here, and for verticals just use a spirit level, since you've got around about 5mm of tolerance to play with if the plasterboard has been fixed a little bit squint. And I'll double check all my screws are below the surface of the plasterboard and at the right centers, and I'll double check all my metal back boxes as well. I want them to be recessed by a few millimeters from the front of the plasterboard, and the cables to be tucked neatly inside the box itself. And I've made a video about both these topics, and you should see the links above and or below. The maximum gap between the boards should be around about 8 to 10mm, and although scrim tape can cover a lot of your sins up to a point, for gaps above 10mm I'll be bonding the scrim first to avoid any possible shrinkage later, like I've done here. And see my other video about all the other things I'll use bonding for. It's amazing stuff and easy to use. Now let's talk skim plaster, exactly what and how to buy. I'll buy British Gypsum multi-finish. You can also go for the Gypsum board finish, but I think multi-finish will be a bit easier to apply for the beginner, and I certainly always use it. I measured out my areas using a drawing I had done in SketchUp. If you don't have this, just go around each room measuring each surface that is going to be plastered. It's the overall surface area of the plasterboard you need, walls and ceilings. 125 kilogram bag of multi-finish will do a total of around 20 square meters at say 1 to 2mm in thickness, and as I'm aiming for 2 coats at roughly 3mm in total, one bag will give me 10 meters squared after both passes. You should definitely do 2 coats. Now I've got 130 square meters for this attic, which you might think is going to be 13 bags, but we need to think about wastage, over-mixing and mistakes, since we're novices after all. Here I use this spreadsheet where I've created a formula to automatically calculate the quantities and the wastage, and by adding our areas I was able to calculate the number of bags I needed. I used the same technique to quantify and buy the plasterboard sheets and the beads I mentioned earlier. You can see my other video here for where you can download these spreadsheets for your own orders. Now, a seasoned plasterer will usually just be able to walk around the job and magically know how many bags they need, and that's why they're experts and we're not. So then I'll buy my multi-finish, and Plaster has a sell-by date, so only buy when you're ready to start. And I shopped around my merchants, and this time, believe it or not, the cheapest I could find was actually B&Q. They delivered it on a pallet in the driveway. Then it was the fun task of taking each 25 kilogram bag up the stairs and placing the correct number of bags for each room to be plastered in the centre of the floor where I intended to mix my plaster. And side note, I also bought a couple of bags of bonding, as I mentioned. So here's my tools, and let's start with the trowel. I use this Marshalltown weathered gold trowel, I think it is. You might think it's expensive, but I'm always going with Marshalltown because of what I was taught by experienced tradesmen and plasterers. You can buy trowels for less than half the price. You're wasting your time and your money. This is the only tool you need, and it needs to be quality to create the quality finish. The size is important as well. I'm a weak, skinny guy, so I went for a 14-inch weathered one, and it did me just fine, but in hindsight, maybe I could have tried a 13-inch. There's also a 15-inch for you bigger guys out there. The smaller the size, the less weight of plaster you're carrying and the less strain on your arm, and the easier it is to get a good motion. The trade-off is that the better that you get, the more passes you need with the smaller trowel. Keep the edges of your trowel protected, and the Marshalltown will last a lifetime. Buckets next. I prefer 3 buckets, a messy cleaning bucket, probably the only thing that you can get a little bit mucky. For everything else, treat your cleaning as if you were a heart surgeon cleaning your scalpels, and immediately after all your plastering jobs, as the slightest bit of contamination will ruin your work. The other bucket I need is a water measuring bucket. I need to keep this spotless, and I'll use a permanent marker and mark the litres up one side, save me getting a jug. So I prefer this orange one over the black one, and the orange one also shows up any dirt particles better, although I am using the black one here for this example. And a mixing bucket for the plaster. There are 2 mixing buckets I can use, and here's where we get into our disciplined preparation stuff. We mentioned our yellow 15-litre flexi bucket, ideal for a half bag mix, and as we improve we need to tackle our larger areas of 10 square metres plus, which will require us to mix full bags of plaster, and we'll use this 25-litre plasterer's bucket for that. It's taller and it's reinforced, good for mixing large quantities, for example a full bag of plaster. Now we need a bucket trowel to turn the plaster in the bucket, sometimes called a gauging trowel, and we'll also keep this spotless. You don't need to worry about buying a super top-notch one. This was just a few pounds from Amazon and has done me fine over the years. We need a hawk to carry the plaster mix. I went for this plastic all-in-one hawk as it was the lightest and simplest I could find. It is pretty hard to keep these things spotless because dried bits of skim seem to collect around the handle, and as they dry it's really hard to clean for a beginner. Plaster dries solid onto the plastic, but because it's skim, it's not going to contaminate your mixes. We need a cleaning brush with a plastic clip to secure onto our messy cleaning bucket. Finally, we need an electric paddle mixer. Now you can get these paddle drill attachments, and if you've got a variable speed drill it could work, but remember, a key thing for the well-informed novice plasterer, as we're beginners, time is not on our side. The fact is, the minute we add water, we have a rapidly decreasing window of minutes to get this plaster mixed onto our float and then onto the wall. And if you're taking ages to just mix up a bucket of plaster because your paddle drill is too small or lacking power, you're just creating a false economy and more opportunity to fail. You need to think about your drill's motor as it turns such a heavy torque versus paying just having something that is geared for multiple speeds, safe and easy to use. And these prices might go up with inflation, but the principle remains the same. I guess if you're doing a very small amount, the attachment is fine, but the great thing about plastering is how cheap the tools are in total, and if you're doing more than a few walls, they'll pay for themselves immediately. So with all that in place, finally, we can start plastering, and which you can see in the video here. You can also see the tools I use in action. And if you enjoyed this video, please hit me a like. It really helps my channel. I'll see you in the next one.